The storm hit Connecticut with the kind of biblical fury that made even the weathermen nervous. Snow didn't fall so much as assault the ground, each flake a tiny fist pounding against windows, roofs, cars left foolishly in driveways. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees, the kind of cold that turned breath into crystals and exposed skin into a medical emergency waiting to happen. Geneva Whitmore stood on the gravel driveway of Blackwell Estate at 11:30 on a Saturday night, wearing a navy silk dress designed for climate-controlled ballrooms, not apocalyptic weather. No coat, no shoes. Those had been ripped off somewhere between the marble foyer and the heavy oak door that had just slammed shut behind her with the finality of a coffin lid. Behind that door, through the frosted glass panels, she could make out shapes. Constance Blackwell, matriarch of the Blackwell dynasty, stood with her arms crossed, pearls gleaming even in the dim light. Beside her, Thaddeus Thad, to his friends, husband to Geneva, for exactly 11 months and 7 days, had his back turned. He was looking at his shoes. He'd been looking at his shoes a lot lately. The cold bit into Geneva's feet first, then crawled up her legs like a living thing. She took 3 steps forward, and her bare sole came down on something sharp. Glass, maybe, or a piece of gravel with edges like a knife. Blood welled up dark against the white snow, and the pain was so bright and immediate that she actually gasped. No one opened the door. Geneva wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture against wind that seemed to have teeth. Her dress, a vintage piece she'd bought at an estate sale for $90, clung to her body like wet paper. The hem was already filthy, dragging through snow that came up past her ankles in some places. She looked back at the house one more time. Blackwell Estate sat on a hill like a predator surveying its territory, all Georgian columns and old money arrogance. Every window blazed with light. Inside, 200 of Connecticut's finest were probably still drinking champagne, still laughing, still whispering about what had just happened. The girl who stole the Blackwell sapphires. The nobody archivist who fooled them all. Except she hadn't stolen anything, and she was far from nobody, and in about 72 hours, every person in that house was going to learn exactly how badly they'd miscalculated. Geneva turned away from the lights and started walking down the driveway. Each step sent fresh agony shooting up from her cut foot. The driveway was a quarter-mile long, lined with bare oak trees that looked like skeletons in the dark. Snow had drifted against the stone walls on either side, building up in shapes that looked almost architectural. Her phone. They'd taken her clutch purse, dumped it on the floor in front of 200 witnesses, but Felicity Blackwell had been so focused on the dramatic reveal of the necklace that she'd forgotten the most important thing. Geneva's phone had been in her coat pocket, and the coat was still hanging in the cloakroom. No phone, no money, no identification. Just a woman in a cocktail dress walking through a blizzard at nearly midnight. The main gate loomed ahead, wrought iron, painted black, topped with decorative spikes that had probably seemed charming in daylight. Geneva reached it and pushed. Locked. Of course it was locked. The Blackwells had an electronic system controlled from the house, and someone, probably Randy the patriarch, who fancied himself a strategic thinker, had made sure she couldn't just walk out the front. Geneva stood at the gate for a long moment, her hand on the frozen metal. The cold was doing strange things to her thoughts now, making them slow and thick like honey. She could feel her core temperature dropping. Hypothermia didn't happen slowly in weather like this. It happened fast, and it happened to people who thought they had more time than they did. She looked to her left. The stone wall was about 6 feet high, rough fieldstone that had probably been built by hand sometime in the 1920s when the original estate was constructed. There were gaps between some of the stone's places where mortar had crumbled away. Handholds. Geneva had never climbed anything in her life. She'd been the girl who read books during gym class, who'd forged notes to get out of rope climbing and obstacle courses. But that girl had also inherited 12,000 acres of Connecticut real estate and $1.8 billion in assets, so apparently she was full of surprises. She grabbed the wall and pulled herself up. The stone scraped her palms raw. Her bare feet, scrabbled for purchase, found a gap slipped. She tried again. The wet silk of her dress caught on a protruding rock and tore with a sound like ripping paper. Geneva didn't stop. She hauled herself higher, fingers going numb, until she could get her knee over the top of the wall. For a moment she balanced there, straddling 6 feet of stone like the world's most pathetic tightrope walker. Then she swung her other leg over and dropped. The landing drove all the air out of her lungs. She hit hard shoulder first and rolled into a snowdrift that cushioned the impact but also soaked her to the skin. For several seconds she just lay there, staring up at the sky where snow fell in sheets backlit by the glow from the estate. She'd made it over the wall. She was outside Blackwell property, and she was going to die out here if she didn't move. Geneva forced herself to her feet. The road stretched in both directions, empty and dark. No streetlights this far from town, just occasional driveways leading to other estates, other monuments to generational wealth. The nearest house was probably half a mile away. The nearest gas station or convenience store maybe 3 miles. She started walking, keeping to the middle of the road where the snowplows would eventually come through. Her feet had gone beyond pain into a kind of distant numbness. That was bad. That was a sign that her body was prioritizing vital organs over extremities, that it had already started making the calculations about what it could afford to lose. Her mind, still sharp despite the cold, went back to earlier in the evening. To the moment it had all fallen apart. The winter gala had been Constance's idea, of course. A way to remind Connecticut's elite that the Blackwells still mattered, still had influence, still threw parties that required tuxedos and practiced small talk. Geneva had spent most of the evening in the corner near the windows watching snow begin to fall, making herself as invisible as possible. She'd gotten good at being invisible over the past 11 months. Constance had found her around 10:30, champagne in hand, lips pressed into that thin line that meant someone was about to be corrected. The sapphire necklace had been around her neck. Then 3 carats of Ceylon sapphire surrounded by diamonds, a Blackwell family heirloom that supposedly went back 5 generations. The old woman had leaned in close, champagne breath hot against Geneva's ear, and said something about staying away from the library, about how Randy had valuables out for appraisal and they didn't need her sticky fingers near real wealth. Geneva had said nothing. She'd learned that silence was safer than defense, that explanations only gave them more ammunition. But she'd gone to this balcony after that, needed the cold air to clear her head, needed distance from the laughter and the clinking glasses, and the way Thad kept introducing her as my wife with the same tone other people used for my luggage. She'd been on the balcony for 45 minutes. There was a waiter who'd brought her water, a young guy who'd looked at her with something like pity. He could testify to that. He'd seen her there, nowhere near the library, nowhere near any safe. But testimony didn't matter when you had 200 witnesses to a necklace falling out of your purse. Geneva's thoughts stuttered as her foot came down on something else sharp. She looked down but couldn't see what had cut her through the darkness and snow. Blood again, she could feel it warm for just a second before the cold turned it to ice. She kept walking. 11 months ago she'd been someone else. Not a different person exactly, but a different version. Geneva Whitmore, who'd just turned 28, who'd spent her 20s doing exactly what she wanted, traveling when she felt like it, reading in bed until noon, working as an archivist because she genuinely loved old documents and the stories they told. Her father had died when she was 19, killed in a car accident on the Merritt Parkway during an ice storm, not unlike this one. He'd left her everything, the Whitmore Trust, the properties, the investments, the weight of 4 generations of careful wealth building. And he'd left her a piece of advice delivered a week before his death during what would be their last conversation. They'd been in his study surrounded by ledgers and land deeds, and he'd looked at her with those serious eyes that never quite smiled even when his mouth did. Never reveal who you are unless absolutely necessary. People change when they know. They become what they think you want them to be, or they become resentful of what you have. Either way, you lose the truth. So Geneva had hidden. Not in any dramatic way. She hadn't faked her death or moved to Alaska. She'd just lived quietly, used her mother's maiden name, sometimes worked a job she didn't need, dated people who knew her as the archivist, not the heiress. And when she'd met Thad Blackwell in a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning, when he'd apologized profusely for ruining her research materials, when he'd insisted on buying her another coffee, and they'd talked for 3 hours about architecture and history and the way cities grew like living things, she'd thought maybe finally she'd found someone who could love Jenny Moore, the archivist. She'd been wrong. Geneva's legs were getting heavy now, each step requiring conscious effort. The cold was winning, shutting down her body one system at a time. She tried to count her steps away to stay focused, but kept losing track. Was that 100, 200 headlights appeared behind her, distant but growing closer. Geneva turned, squinting against the sudden brightness. A car was coming down the road, moving slowly through the snow. Some part of her brain, the part still capable of hope, thought someone from the party, someone who saw what happened and came to help. But the car drove past without slowing. The driver, probably not even seeing the woman in the ruined dress, probably focused entirely on not sliding off the road. The taillights disappeared around a curve, and Geneva was alone again. She thought about Thad, about the way he'd looked at her in the beginning like she was something precious, the way he'd taken her to meet his family and held her hand under the table when his mother made cutting remarks, the way he'd promised in the quiet darkness of their bedroom that he'd always protect her. What a joke that had turned out to be. The first real crack had come around month 4. Geneva had made the mistake of offering advice during a family dinner. Randy had been complaining about a real estate deal that had fallen through. Something about industrial zoning in Hartford, and Geneva had suggested he look into the history of the land trust that controlled the property. She'd been trying to help. She worked with land deeds every day, knew the bureaucracy, knew that sometimes the key to unlocking a property wasn't lawyers, but understanding the original covenant. Constance had looked at her like she'd suggested they all start speaking Esperanto. Felicity had actually laughed, that tinkling socialite laugh that sounded like breaking glass. And Thad had squeezed her hand under the table hard enough to hurt a warning to stop talking. Later in their room, he'd said it gently. "You have to understand, they don't really want input from you. They're just being polite, including you in conversations." That was when Geneva started really paying attention. She noticed how Constance would change the subject whenever Geneva mentioned her work, how Randy would check his phone ostentatiously when she was talking, how Felicity would do this thing where she'd repeat Geneva's suggestions back to the table in a mocking voice, turning reasonable ideas into punchlines. And Thad would just sit there, silent, complicit. By month 6, Geneva had largely stopped talking at family dinners. She'd answer direct questions with monosyllables and spend the rest of the time studying the crown molding or counting the chandelier crystals. That was also when she'd started documenting everything. Mrs. Havisham, the head housekeeper, had been with the Whitmore family for 30 years before Geneva's father died. She'd retired after his death, but had called Geneva a year later, bored and looking for light work. Geneva had offered her a job as consultant to the trust, which really meant keeping an ear to the ground in Connecticut society, letting Geneva know which properties were likely to come on the market, which old families were quietly going broke. When Geneva had called from a payphone 3 weeks into her marriage, voice shaking, saying she'd made a terrible mistake and needed help, Mrs. Havisham had asked exactly one question: "Do you want out, or do you want the truth?" Geneva had thought about it for a long time. Getting out would have been easy. She could have filed for divorce, walked away, gone back to her quiet life. But something in her, some stubborn core that her father would have recognized, wanted the truth, wanted to know exactly who Thaddeus Blackwell was when he thought no one important was watching. So Mrs. Havisham had gotten herself hired at Blackwell Estate. Constance had been thrilled to poach such an experienced housekeeper from whatever mysterious previous employer had taught her to fold fitted sheets into perfect rectangles. And for the past 7 months, Mrs. Havisham had been quietly documenting everything. The recordings were stored in a safe deposit box in Manhattan. 6 months of dinner conversations. 6 months of Constance planning ways to humiliate Geneva. 6 months of Randy discussing business deals that skirted the line of legality. 6 months of Felicity being casually, creatively cruel. And 6 months of Thad saying nothing. Geneva's foot came down on pavement instead of snow, and she realized she'd drifted to the side of the road without noticing. She corrected course, moving back to the center. How long had she been walking? Felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. The road ahead curved, and she couldn't see more than 50 feet through the snow. No lights, no cars, no signs of civilization. She was going to die out here, and they'd find her in the morning frozen in her cocktail dress like some kind of tragic sculpture. The newspapers would probably call it a terrible accident. Woman fleeing domestic dispute succumbs to elements. There might even be a few people at the funeral. Geneva laughed, and the sound that came out was more like a cough. Her chest hurt. Everything hurt actually except her feet, which had gone completely numb. She thought about the necklace, about the way it had felt to watch Felicity dump her purse onto the marble floor. Geneva had known immediately what was going to happen, had seen it in Felicity's eyes, that gleam of triumph. But knowing didn't make it any less devastating. When the sapphires spilled out, didn't make the gasps from the crowd any quieter. Thad had been standing right next to her. She'd turned to him, reached for his hand, and said his name. Just his name. Not a plea, not a question, just Thad. And he'd stepped back. That was what she'd remember, she thought. Not the accusations or the crowd or Constance's theatrical fury, just that step back. Just her husband choosing his family's opinion over her truth. The headlights came from ahead this time, not behind. Geneva stopped walking and raised her hand to shield her eyes. The vehicle was moving fast, too fast for the conditions, and she had just enough time to think, this is it, before it started slowing down. Not slowing, stopping. 3 vehicles, actually. Black Range Rovers with tinted windows appearing out of the snow like mechanical ghosts. They came to a halt in a formation that looked almost military, 1 in front, 2 flanking. Doors opened before the engines stopped. The man who emerged from the lead vehicle was built like a linebacker, dressed in a black suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. He had an earpiece and the kind of posture that screamed former military. He opened a large black umbrella as he approached, holding it over Geneva rather than himself. His voice was gentle, incongruous with his appearance. "Lady Geneva, are you injured?" Geneva tried to answer, but her jaw had locked up from the cold. All she could manage was a nod. The man wrapped something around her shoulders, a coat that was still warm from the car's heater, and then lifted her with the kind of ease that suggested he'd carried much heavier things in much worse conditions. Geneva wanted to protest, to say she could walk, but her legs had stopped taking orders from her brain. She was placed in the back seat of the middle vehicle. The heat was overwhelming, almost painful after the cold. Someone was tucking blankets around her, checking her pupils with a penlight, and then a familiar voice. "Oh, Geneva, what have they done to you?" Mrs. Havisham sat across from her, still wearing her housekeeper's uniform, her face creased with concern that looked almost maternal. Geneva's jaw unlocked enough to speak. "How did you know?" Mrs. Havisham held up a phone. "I have people in the kitchen. The moment you were forced out, I received a text. We were already on the road. The front passenger seat had someone in it, someone Geneva hadn't noticed at first because he'd been on his phone. Now he turned around and Geneva recognized the silver hair, the expensive glasses, the expression of barely contained rage. Atticus Pembroke had been her father's attorney and his father's attorney before that. He was 72 years old and still practiced law with the kind of precision that made younger lawyers weep. He'd handled the Whitmore Trust since before Geneva was born. His voice was quiet, which somehow made it more terrifying. "I received the protocol alert. Tell me what happened." So Geneva told him. The gala, the necklace, the accusation, the eviction. She left out some details, the cut feet, the wall, the certainty of death, but Atticus seemed to fill in the gaps anyway. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled out his tablet, fingers moving across the screen with the speed of someone who'd made peace with technology decades ago. Blackwell Estate. He said it like a curse. Built 1924. Georgian Revival, 8 bedrooms, sits on 847 acres. He tapped something else and a document appeared, old and yellowed even in digital form. 99-year lease. Issued by Whitmore Holdings to Randolph Blackwell Sr. Expires, he looked at his watch, Tuesday. 47 hours from now. Geneva felt something shift in her chest. Something that might have been hope or might have been rage. She'd known about the lease, of course. Her father had shown her the document when she was 20, part of her education in the family holdings. But in the chaos and humiliation of the evening, she'd forgotten. They own the house. Atticus continued. But the land it sits on, the gardens, the driveway, the walls, that's yours. And the renewal clause is quite specific. He turned the tablet so she could see. The language was dense, legal prose from another era, but certain phrases jumped out. Good stewardship, moral character agreement of the landowner. Geneva looked up at Atticus and found him smiling. It wasn't a pleasant smile. By evicting the landowner from her own property, endangering her life in the process, the Blackwell family has violated the character clause, which means Geneva finished the sentence, "I can terminate the lease." "Immediately," Atticus confirmed. "You can order them to remove the structure or surrender it as compensation for breach of contract." Geneva sat back against the heated leather seat, pulling the blankets tighter. Her mind was working again, the cold, receding clarity returning. She thought about Constance standing on the porch, arms crossed, watching her freeze. About Randy's casual cruelty over dinners, the way he'd cut her allowance like she was a child being punished. About Felicity's elaborate schemes to humiliate her. And about Thad, who'd loved Jenny more, right up until loving her became inconvenient. She looked at Atticus. "What else do they need from Whitmore Holdings?" Atticus smiled wider. "Oh, you're going to enjoy this." He pulled up another document, the Hartford Industrial Park. 600 acres of zoned commercial land. Blackwell Enterprises has been trying to acquire development rights for 18 months. It's their only path out of bankruptcy. "Let me guess," Geneva said. Atticus nodded. "Whitmore Trust owns it. We've been the anonymous party in negotiations." Geneva felt something cold settle in her stomach, but it wasn't the hypothermia. It was calculation. Randy had probably spent 100 hours trying to figure out who owned that land, hiring lawyers and investigators, never once thinking to check whether his own daughter-in-law might be the obstacle. She looked at Mrs. Havisham. "The recordings. Do we have tonight?" Mrs. Havisham pulled out her phone video of Felicity placing the necklace in your clutch, time-stamped 10:47 p.m., audio of Constance and Randy planning the frame recorded yesterday afternoon, and she paused audio from the library safe, the combination being entered at 10:52 p.m. by Felicity. Geneva closed her eyes. They'd been so confident, so certain that no one would believe the archivist over the Blackwells. They'd probably rehearsed it, refined it, made sure every detail was perfect. They'd just never considered that the archivist might be recording them back. Atticus was already typing something on his tablet. "I'll file an emergency motion first thing Monday morning. Fraud, defamation, wrongful eviction. And I'll send them notice about the lease termination." "No." Geneva opened her eyes. "Not yet." Atticus raised an eyebrow. Geneva thought about it, about timing and strategy and the satisfaction of watching someone realize they'd destroyed themselves. "Send them the lease notice Monday morning. Just the notice, nothing about why or who I am. Let them think they're meeting with some anonymous trust administrator to beg for a renewal." "Where do you want the meeting?" "Whitmore Tower." "Manhattan." Geneva felt the smile forming cold and precise. "Monday, 10 a.m. Make them wait." Atticus's smile matched hers. "They'll have to wake up early, drive through weekend traffic, sweat in the waiting room while you make them stew." Geneva nodded. "And then I'll tell them exactly who they evicted." The convoy was moving now, 3 vehicles in perfect formation heading south toward Manhattan. Geneva watched Connecticut scroll past through tinted windows, all those estates and old families who thought they owned the world. Her feet were starting to hurt now, a good sign that circulation was returning. Someone had cleaned and bandaged the cuts while she'd been talking to Atticus. Mrs. Havisham was already on her phone arranging things, medical teams standing by at the penthouse, hot bath drawn, soup and bread waiting. Geneva felt the exhaustion hitting now that the adrenaline was fading. She'd been awake since 6 a.m., had spent all day preparing for the gala, had endured hours of being invisible, and then the accusation and eviction and frozen walk. But she couldn't sleep yet. There was too much to plan, too many details to consider. She looked at Atticus. The industrial park. "What's it worth to them?" "Everything," he said simply. "Blackwell Enterprises is leveraged to the hilt. They've got $60 million in debt coming due in March. That Hartford deal is their only viable revenue stream. And without it, bankruptcy by summer." Atticus said it without emotion. "The house will be seized by creditors. Constance's jewelry already leveraged. Randy's art collection promised to pay back a loan from his brother. They're living on credit and reputation." Geneva thought about that, about Constance's certainty, Randy's arrogance, the way they'd looked down on her for having nothing when they were quietly drowning in debt. She made a decision. I want a full audit of their finances. Everything. I want to know every dollar they owe, every asset they own, every lie they've told to banks. Atticus nodded, already making notes. And I want evidence of every time they violated the lease terms. Environmental damage, unauthorized construction, anything that proves they weren't good stewards. Consider it done. Atticus paused, then asked more gently, Geneva, how far do you want to take this? Geneva looked out the window at the darkness, at the snow still falling. She thought about standing on that porch, about the door, closing about Thad's silence. All the way, she said quietly. I want them to understand what they threw away. The convoy drove on through the night, carrying her toward warmth and safety and revenge. The Whitmore penthouse occupied the entire 68th floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan that had been designed by the same architect who'd done the Chrysler Building. Geneva's grandfather had bought it in 1952 for what was then considered an obscene amount of money. Now it was worth approximately $40 million, not that she'd ever sell it. Mrs. Havisham had the medical team waiting in the foyer when they arrived at 3 in the morning. A doctor who looked too young to have finished residency checked Geneva's feet, her core temperature, her pupils. The cuts required butterfly bandages but not stitches. The hypothermia was moderate but not severe. He prescribed hot fluids, rest, and monitoring for the next 24 hours. Geneva sat in the enormous clawfoot tub that had been imported from England in 1954, water so hot it turned her skin pink, and felt the night replay in her mind like a film she couldn't stop watching. Every detail sharp and terrible, Felicity's triumphant expression as the necklace tumbled from the clutch. The collective gasp from 200 guests. Constance's performance of maternal outrage, one hand clutched to her pearls. And Thad. Always Thad, stepping backward, creating distance between himself and his wife, while the crowd watched and judged and found Geneva guilty. She stayed in the bath until the water went lukewarm, then dressed in silk pajamas that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Mrs. Havisham had laid out soup and bread in the kitchen, but Geneva couldn't eat. Her stomach was a knot of fury and hurt that wouldn't untangle. She found Atticus in the study, surrounded by paper. The man apparently didn't sleep. He'd changed out of his evening clothes into a cardigan and slacks, reading glasses perched on his nose tablet in one hand, and a legal pad covered in his precise handwriting in the other. He looked up when she entered. You should rest. Geneva poured herself 2 fingers of her father's Scotch 18-year-old single malt that had been aging since before she was born. Tell me everything. Atticus set down his tablet and picked up the legal pad. Blackwell Enterprises. Founded 1962 by Randolph Blackwell Sr., Thad's grandfather. Started as a residential construction company, expanded into commercial development in the 80s. Current CEO is Randolph Jr. Randy to his friends, of which he has fewer than he thinks. The company had been profitable for decades. Solid growth, conservative investments, the kind of boring success that built generational wealth. Then Randy had taken over 15 years ago and decided boring wasn't good enough. Atticus flipped a page. He leveraged everything to expand. Bought land in markets that looked promising, developed properties on spec, took out loans against future revenue. For a while it worked. He was the golden boy of Connecticut real estate, featured in magazines, invited to speak at conferences. Then 2008 happened. Geneva knew the rest from context, but let Atticus continue. The crash wiped out half their portfolio overnight. Properties they'd bought for development sat empty because no one was building. Loans came due on projects that would never be finished. Randy managed to avoid bankruptcy, but only by selling off the profitable properties and keeping the debt-heavy ones, hoping for a recovery, which never came. Geneva said. Not the way he needed, Atticus confirmed. The residential market recovered, but commercial lagged, and Randy had bet everything on commercial. By 2015, they were hemorrhaging cash. He's been borrowing from Peter to pay Paul ever since. How much debt? $62 million due in staggered payments through next year. The largest chunk, $35 million, comes due March 15th. Geneva did the math. 3.5 months. Atticus nodded. The Hartford Industrial Park was supposed to save them. It's 600 acres already zoned for commercial development, perfectly positioned between two highways. Randy had buyers lined up pre-sold sections to companies planning warehouses and distribution centers. He could have cleared $100 million in profit. Could have. Except the land is controlled by a trust that won't negotiate. Atticus allowed himself a small smile. They've spent 18 months trying to figure out who owns it, hired 3 different law firms, 2 private investigators. Never occurred to them to check whether their son's wife might be the obstacle. Geneva took a sip of scotch, felt it burn a path to her stomach. What happens if the deal falls through bankruptcy? Total liquidation. Atticus was blunt. The creditors will seize everything: the business, the cars, the art collection. Constance's jewelry is already leveraged as collateral on a $2 million loan from Randy's brother. The estate itself would be taken to satisfy debts, and the estate sits on my land, which creates an interesting legal situation. Atticus set down the legal pad and picked up his tablet, pulling up a document. Normally, when a property is seized, the creditors can sell it to recover debts, but they can't sell what they don't own. The house itself has value, but without the land it sits on, it's essentially worthless. Who wants to buy a mansion? They'd have to physically move, so the creditors can't sell it. Not easily. And you, as the landowner, can demand they remove the structure or pay rent. Since they'll have no money, they'll have to abandon it, at which point it becomes yours as compensation for breach of lease. Geneva set down her glass. I want them to know. When it happens, when everything falls apart, I want them to understand exactly who they destroyed. Atticus studied her over his glasses. Revenge is expensive, Geneva. Not in money, you have plenty of that. But in time, energy, peace of mind. Are you certain this is how you want to spend those resources? Geneva thought about the question. Really thought about it, because Atticus wouldn't have asked if he didn't think it mattered. She could walk away, file for divorce, disappear back into anonymity, let the Blackwells collapse under the weight of their own decisions. She didn't need revenge to survive or heal or move forward, but that wasn't the point. I'm not doing this because I need to, Geneva said slowly. I'm doing this because they need to learn. Constance needs to understand that cruelty has consequences. Randy needs to learn that he can't bully his way through life. Felicity needs to face what she did. And Thad. Geneva's jaw tightened. Thad needs to know what it costs to be a coward. Atticus nodded once, accepting her answer. Then we'll make sure the lesson is thorough. He spent the next hour walking her through the strategy. Monday morning, a courier would deliver the lease termination notice to Blackwell Estate. The letter would be formal, cold, and utterly devastating. It would inform them that their 99-year lease had expired and would not be renewed due to violations of the character clause. It would require them to attend a meeting Monday at 10 a.m. to discuss transition of the property. The letter wouldn't mention Geneva. It would be signed by Atticus on behalf of Whitmore Trust, using language so deliberately vague that the Blackwells wouldn't know whether they were meeting with a corporation, a family, or some ancient Connecticut land baron. They'll panic, Atticus said with satisfaction. Randy will call every lawyer he knows. Constance will try to leverage her social connections. They'll spend the entire weekend scrambling. Good. Geneva felt something settle in her chest, cold and certain. Let them scramble. Sunday morning arrived with weak sunshine that made the previous night's storm seem impossible. Geneva woke at 9, later than she'd slept in months, and found Mrs. Havisham had already organized breakfast: poached eggs, fresh fruit bread from a bakery in Brooklyn that Mrs. Havisham swore made the only edible sourdough in New York. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing. Her mind was already in the boardroom, already watching the Blackwells' faces when they realized who owned their future. Mrs. Havisham set down a cup of coffee. The recordings are compiled. I've organized them by category: financial discussions, social cruelty, the frame job. Everything is time-stamped and verified. Geneva looked up. How bad is it, Mrs.? Havisham's expression was grim. Worse than you know. There are conversations from before you were married. Constance discussing how to prevent the wedding, how to drive you away if it happened anyway. Randy talking about your background check, how they found nothing suspicious and that itself was suspicious. They were looking for reasons to hate me before they even met me. They were looking for confirmation of what they'd already decided. Mrs. Havisham corrected. That anyone their son chose independently couldn't possibly be good enough. Geneva thought about that, about the impossibility of her position from the start, too poor to be acceptable, but any signs of hidden wealth would have been seen as deception. There was no version of herself that would have satisfied them, because the problem was never who she was. It was that she existed outside their control. Her phone buzzed. A text from Atticus Package delivered. Confirmed receipt 9:47 a.m. It was happening. Across Connecticut in the morning room of Blackwell Estate, Constance Blackwell was working her way through a grapefruit and reading the society pages when Randy walked in holding a cream-colored envelope like it might explode. His face had gone gray. "We have a problem." Constance looked up annoyed at the interruption. "What kind of problem?" "The Whitmore Trust. The lease. It's—" Randy's hand shook slightly. "It's over." Constance set down her spoon with careful precision. "What do you mean?" Over. Randy handed her the letter. She read it once quickly, then again slowly, her expression shifting from irritation to confusion to something approaching panic. "This is impossible." Her voice had gone thin. "The lease doesn't expire until next year." Randy pointed to a line in the letter. "It expired yesterday, November 30th. And they're invoking the character clause to deny renewal." Character clause. Constance repeated it like a foreign phrase. "What character clause?" "The one that requires good stewardship and moral conduct." Randy collapsed into a chair. "We violated it. They claim we violated it, and they're terminating the lease effective immediately." Constance's mind was racing. Geneva would have recognized the expression, that calculating look she got when trying to manipulate a situation to her advantage. "This is about money. Everything is about money. They want us to pay more." "We'll negotiate." Randy shook his head. "They want us at a meeting. Monday morning, 10 a.m. Manhattan, to discuss transition of the property." "Transition?" Constance's voice had dropped to a whisper. "They want us to leave. The house, the gardens, all of it. We have to remove our property or surrender it. This is because of that girl." Constance stood abruptly. That archivist. She must have complained to them, told them some sob story about being thrown out. Randy wasn't listening. He was reading the letter again, looking for loopholes for any language that might give them leverage. "We need lawyers. I'll call Stevenson. He handles property law." "It's Sunday," Constance interrupted. "No one is in their office." "Then we'll pay them to be in their office." Randy was already pulling out his phone. "This is everything, Constance. If we lose the estate, we lose our credibility. And if we lose our credibility, we lose the Hartford deal." They stared at each other across the morning room, both arriving at the same terrible conclusion simultaneously. Without Hartford, they had no way to pay the March debts. Without the estate, they had no collateral to borrow against. Without either, they had nothing. Randy made 6 phone calls before he found a lawyer willing to work on Sunday. The man quoted a fee that would have made Constance faint if she'd been listening. Randy agreed immediately. Thaddeus wandered in around 11, hungover from the gala, looking for coffee. He found his parents in the study, surrounded by papers, his mother's face tight with stress, his father on his 3rd bourbon despite the early hour. "What's going on?" Randy gestured at the letter without looking up. "Our lease on the property is terminated. We have to move." Thad blinked, processing slowly. "Move where? Anywhere that isn't here." Constance's voice was sharp. "Because apparently we violated some archaic morality clause, and the trust that owns the land has decided we're not worthy." Thad picked up the letter, skimmed it. Something in his chest tightened, though he couldn't articulate why. "When did this happen?" "The lease expired yesterday. Technically, we've been trespassing since midnight." "Yesterday." Thad's mind went to the gala, to the scene in the ballroom, to Geneva being forced out into the storm. The timing felt wrong, felt connected somehow, but he couldn't make the pieces fit. Felicity arrived home around 1, back from brunch with friends, and found the house in chaos. Randy was yelling at someone on the phone about precedent and legal standing. Constance was going through financial documents, her movements sharp and angry. Thad sat in the corner looking lost. "What's the crisis?" Constance filled her in with clipped efficiency. Felicity listened, then shrugged. "So we move. It's just a house." Constance's look could have flash-frozen water. "It's not just a house. It's our position, our reputation. The Blackwells have lived on this estate for 100 years, so we'll be the generation that moves." Felicity examined her nails, unconcerned. "I never liked it here anyway. Too far from the city." But even Felicity started to understand the severity when Randy explained the Hartford situation, the debt payments, the cascade of failures that losing the estate would trigger. The lawyer arrived at 3, a man named Morrison, who specialized in property disputes and charged $500 an hour. He reviewed the lease agreement, made notes, asked questions that Randy couldn't answer. Finally, he set down his pen. "The character clause is legally binding. If they can prove you violated it, they have grounds for termination." "We didn't violate anything," Constance insisted. Morrison looked at her over his glasses. "Did you maintain the property according to environmental standards? Did you make unauthorized modifications? Did you conduct yourself in a manner befitting the trust's values?" Randy and Constance exchanged glances. There had been that extension to the West Wing done without permits because Randy knew someone on the zoning board, and the wetland drainage that probably violated EPA guidelines, and a dozen other small corner cuttings that had seemed smart at the time. Morrison saw their expressions. "I see. Well, your best approach is to argue that any violations were minor and that termination is a disproportionate response. You'll also want to come to the meeting prepared to negotiate. Offer to remedy any issues, pay additional rent, whatever it takes to stay. And if they won't negotiate, then you have approximately 60 days to remove your property before they can claim it as abandoned." Morrison started packing his briefcase. "I'd recommend you begin making contingency plans." After he left, the family sat in the study as afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor. No one spoke. They were each doing the math in their heads, calculating how bad this could get. Thad finally broke the silence. "Where's Geneva?" The question landed like a grenade. Constance's head snapped up. "What Geneva? My wife. Where is she? How should I know?" Constance's voice was ice, probably at a police station confessing to theft. Thad stood, something finally clicking into place. "We threw her out. Last night, in a blizzard. She stole our family heirloom." Randy didn't look up from the papers. "Did she?" Thad's voice was quiet, but something in it made his father pause. "Did anyone actually see her take it? Or did we just find it in her purse?" Felicity shifted uncomfortably. Thad looked at his sister, really looked, and saw guilt flash across her face. "What did you do?" "Nothing." Felicity's voice was too defensive. "I found the necklace in her clutch." "You found it. Or you put it there." The silence stretched. Constance stood slowly. "Felicity, tell me you didn't." Felicity's composure cracked. She needed to go. She was dead weight, everyone knew it. I gave us a reason to get rid of her without a messy divorce." "You framed her." Thad's voice was hollow. "You framed my wife for stealing, and we threw her out in a snowstorm and she could have died. But she didn't." Felicity shot back. "She's probably fine, holed up in some motel planning to sue us. We don't know that." Thad was heading for the door. "I'm going to find her." Constance's voice cracked like a whip. "You'll do no such thing. We have bigger problems than your gold-digging wife's hurt feelings." Thad stopped. "She's not a gold digger." "No." "Then what was she?" Thad realized he didn't have an answer. What did he actually know about Geneva? She'd been an archivist, she'd said. Worked with historical documents. But where, for whom he'd never asked. Never visited her at work. Never met her friends or family. In 11 months of marriage, he'd learned almost nothing about the woman he'd promised to love forever. Because he'd never bothered to ask, never thought it mattered. She was his wife, his choice, and that should have been enough for his family to accept her. When it wasn't, he'd convinced himself it was easier to keep the peace than to fight every battle. Now she was gone, and he didn't even know where to look for her. Randy's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his face went white. "It's Stevenson, from the Hartford deal." He answered, listened, and with each passing second seemed to age a year. When he hung up, his hand was shaking. "The buyers are pulling out. Someone told them we're having financial difficulties and they don't want to be associated with a sinking ship." Who would Constance started, then stopped. Everyone at the gala had seen the theft accusation. By now it would be all over their social circle, the Blackwells throwing out a daughter-in-law family drama potential scandal. Their carefully maintained veneer of stability was cracking, and like sharks, sensing blood, their business partners were circling. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. The Blackwell family drove to Manhattan in near silence. Randy at the wheel, Constance beside him, Thad and Felicity in the back. They dressed like they were going to war, expensive suits, designer accessories, armor made of fabric, and status symbols. Whitmore Tower was in Midtown, 72 floors of steel and glass that looked like it could cut the sky. Randy pulled up to the valet, handed over the keys, and led his family into the lobby. The receptionist was expecting them. She directed them to the 65th floor executive offices and told them someone would collect them shortly. The elevator ride was silent. Felicity checked her phone. Thad stared at his shoes. Constance stood rigid, jaw clenched. Randy tried to project confidence, but his hand trembled slightly when he pressed the button. The 65th floor was all marble and dark wood abstract art on the walls, worth more than most houses. The receptionist here was older, wearing glasses and an expression that suggested she'd seen everything and been impressed by none of it. She looked up as they approached the Blackwell party. "Yes." Randy's voice was firm. "We have a 10 o'clock with the Whitmore Trust. Of course. Please have a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." Shortly turned into 15 minutes, then 30, then 45. The waiting room was deliberately uncomfortable. The chairs were expensive but not quite right, the angles slightly off. The temperature was too warm. There was no clock, but everyone could feel time passing, stretching, becoming elastic and suffocating. Constance was sweating through her silk blouse. Randy kept checking his watch. Felicity had given up on her phone and was staring at the ceiling. Thad was thinking about Geneva, about where she might be, whether she was safe. At 10:53, the receptionist's phone buzzed. She listened, nodded, hung up. "They're ready for you now." She led them down a hallway lined with photographs, black and white images of Connecticut from different eras, showing how the land had changed over decades. Farmland becoming suburbs, becoming cities. Geneva would have loved these photos. Thad thought, then pushed the thought away. The receptionist opened a heavy door and gestured them inside. The boardroom was massive, designed to intimidate. A table that could seat 40 people stretched toward floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. The view was extraordinary, the kind that reminded visitors exactly how much money and power it took to control space like this. At the far end of the table, a leather chair faced the window. Atticus Pembroke stood near the head of the table, 72 years old, and radiating the kind of authority that made experienced lawyers nervous. He gestured to the chairs. "Please, sit." The Blackwells sat. Randy cleared his throat. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about the lease." "There's been no misunderstanding." Atticus's voice was crisp. "The lease expired. The landowner has chosen not to renew based on multiple violations of the character clause. We'd like to discuss those violations." Randy tried again. "We're prepared to remedy any issues." "Are you prepared to remedy endangering someone's life?" The question hung in the air like smoke. "I'm sorry." Randy's confusion was genuine. Atticus picked up a remote and pointed it at the wall. A screen descended and video began to play. It showed the library at Blackwell Estate, time-stamped Saturday 10:52 p.m. Felicity entered the frame, looked around to make sure she was alone, then opened the safe. She pulled out the sapphire necklace with practiced ease, tucked it into her evening bag, and left. The next clip showed a hallway. Felicity approached a table where several clutch purses were laid out, guests who'd checked their bags. She found one, opened it, and carefully placed the necklace inside. The camera angle was perfect. The lighting was clear. There was no possibility of mistaken identity. Felicity made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. Constance's face had gone ashen. Atticus clicked to the next clip, audio this time. Constance's voice came through the speakers discussing the plan with Randy, how they'd frame Geneva, how they'd use it as grounds for annulment, how they'd avoid paying any settlement. Randy tried to speak, but no sound came out. The final clip was the security camera from the front entrance. It showed Geneva being physically pushed onto the porch, showed the door closing, showed her standing there in the snow for several seconds before beginning to walk. The timestamp read 11:31 p.m. The temperature reading in the corner showed 8 degrees. Atticus stopped the video. Geneva Whitmore spent approximately 40 minutes walking in sub-freezing temperatures without a coat or shoes. She suffered moderate hypothermia lacerations to her feet and was hours away from life-threatening exposure when she was extracted. Geneva Whitmore. Randy latched onto the name like a lifeline. Our daughter-in-law's name is Geneva Moore. Her name is Geneva Whitmore, Atticus corrected. She chose to go by Moore when you met, a preference for privacy that I imagine she now regrets. The chair at the end of the table began to turn. Geneva sat there in a dove-gray suit that probably cost more than the Blackwells car, her hair styled in a way Jenny Moore had never worn it, her posture perfect. On her finger sat a heavy gold ring with the Whitmore seal. Around her neck, a simple strand of pearls that were each individually worth 5 figures. She looked at her husband and his family with eyes that held absolutely nothing. Hello? Her voice was calm, almost pleasant. I believe we have some property matters to discuss. Constance Blackwell fainted. Not the delicate swoon she'd performed at charity events when the attention wasn't sufficient, but a genuine collapse that sent her sliding sideways in the expensive leather chair. Randy lurched to catch her, his face the color of old newspaper. Geneva watched without moving. She'd imagined this moment for 72 hours, refined it in her mind until every detail was perfect. The reality was both more and less satisfying than she'd anticipated. More because the shock on their faces was absolute. Less because even now some small part of her had hoped Thad would defend her, would stand up, would prove she'd been wrong about him. He just sat there, staring, his mouth working soundlessly. Atticus produced a water bottle with the efficiency of someone who'd anticipated the fainting. He set it on the table near Randy, then returned to his position at Geneva's right hand. Randy managed to get Constance upright, patting her cheeks until her eyes fluttered open. She looked around in confusion, saw Geneva still sitting there, and the memory crashed back. Her hand went to her throat, clutching for pearls that weren't there. Geneva let the silence stretch. Let them absorb it. Let the reality settle into their bones the way cold had settled into hers on that frozen road. Finally, Thad found his voice. "You're a Whitmore." The observation hung in the air simultaneously, obvious and impossible. Geneva inclined her head fractionally. "My father was Edmund Whitmore. He died when I was 19 and left me sole control of the family trust. 12,000 acres in Connecticut, various properties in Manhattan, and approximately $1.8 billion in assets." Felicity made a sound like something dying. "I chose to live quietly." Geneva continued, her tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "I worked as an archivist because I love historical documents. I dated people who knew me as Jenny Moore because I wanted to be valued for who I am, not what I own." Randy had recovered enough to speak, though his voice shook. "You lied to us." Geneva's expression didn't change. "I never lied. I told Thad I was an archivist. I am. I archive my family's land records. I said I was between positions. I'd just finished cataloging our 17th century deeds. I wore simple clothes and lived modestly because that's my preference. You assumed poverty because you couldn't imagine any other reason for simplicity. But you let us think Constance started. I let you think nothing." Geneva's voice hardened slightly. "I existed, and you decided who I must be based on your own prejudices. When Thad brought me to meet you, you'd already concluded I was inadequate. Nothing I said or did would have changed that. Atticus picked up a folder. For the record, the Blackwell family conducted a background check on Geneva Moore 3 weeks before the wedding. They found employment records, tax returns, a rental history. Everything legitimate because it was all true. They also noted, and I quote from the investigator's report, subject has no social media presence, no public records before age 22, and no traceable family connections. This itself is suspicious and suggests possible identity fraud. He set down the folder. You were looking for reasons to reject her before you'd even met her. Thad's face had gone through several colors. I didn't know about the background check. But you knew how they treated her. Atticus's voice was mild. You knew about the cutting remarks, the deliberate exclusions, the casual cruelty. And you said nothing. Geneva held up a hand. We're not here to discuss Thad's failures as a husband. We're here to discuss the property. She pulled her own folder from the stack in front of her, opened it with precise movements. Blackwell Estate sits on 847 acres owned by Whitmore Holdings. The lease agreement, established in 1924, runs for 99 years and expired at midnight on November 30th. The renewal clause requires good stewardship of the land and moral character from the tenants. She looked up, meeting Randy's eyes. You've violated both requirements. That's subjective. Randy tried. Geneva cut him off. You drained wetlands without EPA approval in 2019. You added an unauthorized wing to the east side of the house in 2021, exceeding the footprint specified in the lease. You dumped construction debris in the north woods, contaminating the soil. Those are stewardship violations. She pulled out another document. As for moral character, you planned and executed a fraud to frame an innocent person for theft. You endangered that person's life by forcing her into life-threatening weather conditions. And you did it with premeditation, as evidenced by the recordings. Atticus added, the character clause exists because the Whitmore family has always believed that land ownership carries responsibility, that those who control property have an obligation to treat both the land and the people on it with integrity. You failed on both counts. We can fix the environmental issues. Randy was grasping now. We'll remediate the wetlands, remove the contaminated soil, pay any fines. Geneva shook her head. The lease has expired. There's nothing to fix. Then we'll negotiate a new lease. Randy pulled himself together, shifting into deal-maker mode. We'll pay triple the previous rate. We'll agree to quarterly inspections. The land isn't available for lease. Geneva's voice was final. Randy's carefully constructed composure shattered. You can't just take our home. I'm not taking anything, Geneva corrected. You built a house on land you didn't own under a lease that is now expired. The structure belongs to you. You're welcome to move it. Move it! Constance had found her voice again, shrill with panic. Move a 20,000-square-foot Georgian mansion, or surrender it. Geneva's tone didn't change. Per the lease agreement, if the structure is not removed within 60 days of lease termination, it becomes property of the landowner as compensation for breach of contract. This is extortion. Randy stood trying to reclaim some authority through height. We'll fight this. We'll sue for wrongful termination. On what grounds? Atticus was already pulling up another document. That you didn't violate the environmental regulations. We have photographs and soil samples. That you didn't frame Geneva for theft. We have video evidence. That you didn't endanger her life. We have hospital records documenting hypothermia and lacerations consistent with exposure. He looked up. I've been practicing property law for 47 years. Mr. Blackwell, I wrote the textbook on land trusts that they use at Yale Law School. If you want to sue, I welcome it. Discovery will be fascinating. Thad finally spoke, his voice raw. Geneva, please. Can we talk? Alone. Geneva looked at him, really looked, and tried to find some remnant of the man she'd fallen in love with. The one who'd spent 3 hours discussing architecture over coffee, who'd quoted Whitman while walking through a park, who'd held her hand and promised to build a life together. That man had never existed, or he had briefly until the first time his mother disapproved, and he chose silence over defense. "There's nothing to discuss." Her words came out colder than she'd intended, but she didn't soften them. "I didn't know." Thad's voice cracked. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what Felicity did. I didn't know." "You knew I was cold," Geneva interrupted. "You knew I was being humiliated. You knew your sister dumped my purse on the floor in front of 200 people and a necklace fell out that I had no reason to steal. You knew I was innocent." Thad's hands were shaking. "I thought I didn't." "You didn't think. Because thinking would have required you to choose between me and your family's approval. And we both know which one mattered more." The words landed like blows. Thad flinched but didn't argue. Geneva stood signaling the meeting was ending. "You have 48 hours to make a decision. After that window closes, the options narrow considerably." "What are the options?" Randy's voice had lost all its bluster. Geneva glanced at Atticus, who pulled out a prepared document. "Option A, you vacate the property within 48 hours. You may take personal clothing photographs and items of purely sentimental value. All furniture, art, vehicles, and other assets acquired through loans collateralized against the property remain. You also sign a full written confession regarding the theft frame, which will be kept sealed unless you attempt to challenge any of these terms legally." "And in exchange?" Randy asked. "In exchange, no criminal charges." Atticus's tone was matter-of-fact. "Ms. Whitmore will not press charges for fraud, conspiracy, defamation, or reckless endangerment. The confession remains sealed. You walk away with your freedom." Constance found her voice. "That's it. We lose everything and get nothing. You get to avoid prison." Geneva's voice was ice. "Felicity framed me for grand larceny. That's 2 to 7 years. You and Randy conspired to commit fraud and endangered my life. That's additional years. Federal charges for the environmental violations could add more. So, yes, Mrs. Blackwell, you get something quite valuable, your freedom." "What's option B?" Felicity spoke for the first time, her voice small. "We proceed with criminal prosecution," Atticus said simply. "All charges, all evidence made public. The trial would take approximately 18 months. The publicity would be extensive. And given the video evidence, conviction is virtually certain." "What about the Hartford property?" Randy's voice was barely audible. "The industrial park. We need that deal to survive." Geneva's expression didn't change. "The Hartford property is owned by Whitmore Holdings. Your company has been negotiating with my trust for 18 months without realizing it. That deal is now terminated. You'll bankrupt us." Randy's face had gone gray. "Without Hartford, we can't pay our debts. We'll lose everything." "Yes." Geneva's voice was soft but absolute. "You will. And you'll understand what it feels like to stand in the cold with nothing, wondering how you'll survive the night." Constance found some reserve of venom. "You vindictive little," Geneva's voice cut through like a blade. "I was prepared to die on that road. Do you understand that my core temperature had dropped to 94 degrees? Another 30 minutes and I would have lost consciousness. Another hour and they would have found my body in the morning, frozen in a dress you mocked." The boardroom went silent. "I didn't want revenge," Geneva continued, and something in her voice made even Atticus go still. "I wanted to be loved. I wanted to be valued. I wanted a family that saw me as a person instead of a problem. And when I couldn't have that, I wanted out. A quiet divorce, a fresh start, maybe 6 months of therapy to work through the damage." She leaned forward slightly. "But you couldn't even give me that. You had to destroy me. You had to make it public and humiliating and cruel. You had to frame me for theft and throw me into a blizzard and congratulate yourselves on eliminating dead weight." Her hands were steady on the table. "So yes, Mrs. Blackwell, I am vindictive. I am taking your home and your business and your social standing. I am dismantling everything you built on cruelty and arrogance. And I'm going to sleep soundly while I do it because you taught me something valuable, that kindness without power is just another way to be victimized." The silence that followed was absolute. Atticus finally broke it, his voice gentle. "You have 48 hours to decide. After that, we proceed with option B by default. My office will send over the formal documents this afternoon. The meeting is over." Geneva stood, and the Blackwells understood they were being dismissed. They filed out like survivors of a shipwreck, stunned and unsteady. Thad looked back, once his expression a mixture of regret and incomprehension. Geneva met his eyes for a brief moment, then looked away. The heavy doors closed with a sound like finality. Geneva sat back down in the leather chair and felt something release in her chest. Not triumph exactly. Not satisfaction. Just the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd been holding herself together through sheer will and could finally let go. Atticus poured her a glass of water from the crystal pitcher. "How do you feel?" Geneva considered the question. "Honestly, tired. Sad. Like I just demolished something that was already rotting from the inside." "That's accurate." Atticus sat down across from her. "Buildings with bad foundations always collapse eventually. You just controlled the timing." Geneva took a sip of water. "What happens now?" "Now they panic." Atticus pulled out his tablet, already making notes. "Randy will call every attorney he knows. Constance will try to leverage social connections that no longer exist. They'll spend the next 48 hours looking for a way out that doesn't exist. And when they don't find one, they'll accept option A." Atticus's voice was certain. "Randy's a pragmatist under all that bluster. He'll do the math and realize that keeping his freedom is worth more than the house." Geneva looked out the window at Manhattan spread below them. "I want the property converted. Not sold, not preserved as is. Converted into something useful." "What did you have in mind?" "A residential facility for women leaving domestic situations." Geneva had been thinking about this since Saturday night on that frozen road. Transitional housing, job training, legal assistance. Everything someone needs to rebuild their life after escaping. Atticus was quiet for a moment. "That's a powerful statement. It's also practical." Geneva turned back to face him. "The estate is isolated enough for privacy, large enough to house multiple families, and the Blackwell name getting permanently associated with helping abuse survivors has a certain poetic justice to it. I'll start researching nonprofit partners." Atticus made a note. "We'll need to do significant renovations, bring everything up to code for that kind of facility. I want Mrs. Havisham to oversee it," Geneva said. "She understands what it means to witness abuse and feel powerless to stop it. She'll make sure the residents feel safe." "Done." Atticus closed his tablet. "What about you? What happens to Geneva Whitmore now?" Geneva considered the question. She'd spent 11 months being small, being quiet, being Jenny Moore, who asked for nothing and expected less. She'd spent the 72 hours since the eviction being Geneva Whitmore, wielding power like a weapon, watching her enemies crumble. Neither version felt complete. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I know I'm done hiding, done pretending to be less than I am just to make other people comfortable." "Good." Atticus's approval was evident. "Your father would be proud." The mention of her father brought an unexpected wave of emotion. Edmund Whitmore had died in a winter storm not unlike the one Geneva had walked through. She'd been 19, still in college, suddenly responsible for billions in assets and thousands of acres of land. He'd taught her to be careful to protect herself, to understand that wealth made you a target. But he'd also taught her that land ownership carried responsibility, that those who controlled resources had an obligation to use them wisely. The Blackwells had proven his first lesson correct. Now Geneva would honor his second. The Blackwell family drove back to Connecticut in absolute silence. Randy's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. Constance stared out the window, her mind racing through social calculations that no longer mattered. Felicity cried quietly in the back seat, mascara running in dark streaks. Thad sat beside his sister, numb. They arrived at the estate in late afternoon. The house looked different now, knowing it wasn't theirs. The Georgian columns seemed like props from a stage set. The manicured lawns felt like borrowed finery being worn by someone who couldn't afford the cleaning bill. Randy went directly to his study and started making calls. The first was to Morrison, the property lawyer who'd reviewed the lease on Sunday. The man listened to Randy's explanation of the meeting, asked several pointed questions, and delivered his assessment. "You have no legal recourse. The lease terms are ironclad. The violations are documented, and frankly, you're lucky she's not pressing criminal charges. What about the Hartford deal? Morrison's sigh was audible through the phone. If Whitmore Holdings owns it, they can terminate negotiations at will. You have no contractual right to that land. So we're finished. I'm afraid so. Morrison's voice held genuine sympathy. My advice is to accept option A, take what you can carry, and start over somewhere less expensive. Randy ended the call and sat staring at the mahogany desk that had belonged to his father. The desk would stay, of course. Everything in this room had been purchased with borrowed money collateralized against land they'd never owned. His next call was to the primary lender, a bank that held $35 million in debt coming due March 15th. The conversation was brief and brutal. Without the Hartford deal or the estate as collateral, the bank would not extend the loan. Payment was due in full or they'd force bankruptcy proceedings. Randy called 6 more people, business partners, investors, his brother in Vermont who'd loaned them $2 million. Every conversation ended the same way. No one wanted to be associated with a sinking ship. By 8 p.m., Randy understood that Geneva had been thorough. She hadn't just taken the estate. She'd severed every lifeline, blocked every exit, ensured that the Blackwell collapse would be total and irreversible. He poured himself a bourbon and tried to figure out where it had all gone wrong. The expansion in the 2000s had seemed smart at the time. The leverage, the aggressive growth, the calculated risks. It had worked for years. But somewhere in the pursuit of more, he'd stopped paying attention to the foundation. Had cut corners on environmental regulations because the fines were less than the cost of compliance. Had borrowed against tomorrow to fund today. Had built an empire on debt and arrogance. And now the bill was due. Constance found Felicity in her bedroom packing designer clothes into suitcases with jerky, panicked movements. "What are you doing?" "Leaving." Felicity didn't look up. "Moving to Boston, maybe New York. Somewhere no one knows the Blackwell name. Running away won't help." Constance sat on the edge of the bed. "This will follow you." Felicity's hands stilled. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just wanted her gone. I thought if we caught her stealing, it would be grounds for annulment without a settlement. I didn't know." "You didn't know she owned the land under our feet," Constance finished. "None of us did. Would it have mattered?" Felicity turned to face her mother. "If you'd known she was a billionaire, would you have treated her differently?" Constance wanted to say no, wanted to claim that character mattered more than money. But she'd spent her entire adult life believing the opposite, teaching her children that wealth and status were the only things worth pursuing. Honestly, Constance's voice was small. "Yes, I would have. And that's the problem, isn't it?" Felicity resumed packing. "What happens to us now?" "We start over." Constance tried to sound confident. "Your father and I have done it before. After the 2008 crash, we rebuilt. We can do it again." But the conviction wasn't there. They'd been younger then, had more time to recover. And they hadn't been carrying the weight of public humiliation, hadn't destroyed someone who turned out to be far more powerful than they'd imagined. Thad found his father in the study around midnight. Randy was on his 3rd bourbon, surrounded by papers that represented a business empire in free fall. "Have you decided?" Randy looked up. "There's nothing to decide. We take option A or we go to prison. Some choice." Thad sat down across from the desk. "Did we really do those things? The wetland drainage, the construction debris?" Randy waved a hand dismissively. "Environmental regulations are designed to stifle business. Everyone cuts those corners. Not everyone gets caught," Thad pointed out. "We weren't caught. We were set up." Randy's voice rose. "That girl, that woman, she orchestrated this entire thing. Married you under false pretenses, let us treat her poorly to build a case, then sprang the trap. Did she—" Thad's voice was quiet. "Or did we just give her ammunition by being exactly who we are?" Randy stared at his son. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means we framed an innocent person for theft. Geneva didn't make Felicity put that necklace in her purse. We did that. We threw her out in a blizzard. Geneva didn't endanger her own life. We did that. She lied about who she was." Randy started. "She used a different name." Thad interrupted. There's a difference. And even if she had lied, does that justify attempted murder? The word hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't murder. Randy's voice had lost its certainty. We were angry, we made a rash decision. 8 degrees. Thad's voice was flat. I looked it up. 8 degrees Fahrenheit heavy snow, no coat or shoes. The survival rate for that level of exposure is less than 50% after 1 hour. Geneva was out there for 40 minutes. She's fine. Randy tried. She survived. Because she had resources we didn't know about. Thad stood. But we didn't know that when we threw her out. As far as we knew, we were sending her to die. And we did it because she embarrassed us at a party. Randy had no response to that. Thad walked to the door, then turned back. I'm signing the confession. Whatever happens to the family, I'm taking responsibility for my part in it. You'll destroy us. Randy's voice was desperate. If you admit guilt, every creditor will come after us. They're already coming, Thad said simply. Geneva made sure of that. The only question now is whether we face it with some shred of integrity or whether we lie until the end. He left his father sitting in the study surrounded by the wreckage of choices that had seemed so smart at the time. Wednesday morning, a courier arrived at Blackwell Estate with formal documents from Atticus Pembroke's office. Randy signed them with a hand that shook slightly, watched the courier leave, and understood that the 48-hour countdown had officially begun. Constance started the sorting process, what they could take, what they had to leave. The clothes were theirs clearly. The photographs, the personal jewelry that predated the estate. But everything else, the furniture, the art, the dishes, the silver had been purchased with borrowed money. Mrs. Havisham arrived Wednesday afternoon with an inventory team. She was professional and thorough, checking every item against purchase records, confirming what could leave and what would stay. Constance tried to argue about a painting she'd bought 10 years ago. Mrs. Havisham politely showed her the receipt purchased at auction using a home equity line of credit. The painting stayed. Felicity tried to take a necklace she'd worn to a charity gala. Mrs. Havisham checked the records purchased with a credit card that had been paid off using loan proceeds. The necklace stayed. Randy tried to claim his desk, the one his father had used. Mrs. Havisham consulted the original estate inventory built into the house in 1952, part of the permanent fixtures. The desk stayed. By Thursday evening, the Blackwell family understood exactly how little they actually owned. Suitcases of clothes, boxes of photographs, a few pieces of jewelry. Everything else had been illusion borrowed against a future that would never arrive. Randy had rented a 3-bedroom apartment in Stamford, the best he could afford with their remaining liquid assets. It was a come-down from the estate in ways that went beyond square footage. The walls were thin. The ceilings were low. You could hear neighbors arguing through the vents. They loaded their belongings into 2 cars on Friday morning. The Bentley had been repossessed on Thursday. Turned out it, too, had been bought on credit. They were left with a 10-year-old Volvo and Randy's pickup truck from before the business took off. Constance stood in the foyer one last time, looking at the grand staircase, the chandelier that had hosted 1,000 dinner parties, the marble floors she'd walked across as mistress of the house for 30 years. All of it had been borrowed. All of it had been temporary. She just hadn't known it. They drove away at noon on Friday, didn't look back, couldn't bear to see the house shrinking in the rearview mirror. Geneva took possession of the estate on Friday afternoon. She walked through empty rooms that echoed with her footsteps, examined the study, where she'd endured countless humiliating dinners, stood in the bedroom she'd shared with Thad. The house felt smaller without the Blackwells' presence, without Constance's cutting remarks filling the air, without Randy's bluster, without Felicity's calculated cruelty. It was just a building now, well constructed but not particularly special. She found herself in the library where Felicity had stolen the necklace. The safe was still there, door hanging open, empty. Geneva wondered if Felicity had even hesitated, if there'd been a moment where she'd considered that actions have consequences. Probably not. People like the Blackwells rarely thought past the immediate gratification of cruelty. Mrs. Havisham found her there an hour later. The architect is here, ready to discuss the conversion plans. Geneva took one last look around the library. Actually, I want this room to be the counseling center, the place where women can meet with therapists, lawyers, social workers, where they can plan their next steps. Because Felicity used it for plotting, Mrs. Havisham asked. Because I want every dark thing that happened here transformed into light. Geneva turned away from the safe. The dining room becomes a communal kitchen. The ballroom becomes a daycare. The master bedroom becomes administrative offices. And your old room. Geneva smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. A bedroom for whoever needs it most. Over the next several weeks, Geneva threw herself into the conversion project. Architects, contractors, social workers, nonprofit partners. Every decision was deliberate, every choice made with the future residents in mind. The Blackwell crest above the door was removed, replaced with a simple plaque, Whitmore House. A safe place to begin again. The gardens were redesigned by a landscape architect who specialized in healing spaces. Meditation areas, vegetable gardens, the residents could tend play spaces for children. The wetlands that Randy had illegally drained were restored at significant expense. Environmental engineers removed the contaminated soil from the North Woods. The unauthorized wing was demolished, its materials donated to Habitat for Humanity. Geneva wanted every trace of the Blackwell violations erased. The land healed, the property transformed into something that gave back instead of taking. She visited the site every few days, watching the progress. Walls being painted in soft colors instead of the heavy burgundy Constance had preferred. Windows being replaced with energy-efficient models. Solar panels being installed on the roof. On one of these visits, she encountered Thad. He was standing at the end of the driveway looking up at the house. He'd lost weight in the month since the meeting, looked older somehow. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by jeans and a flannel shirt. Geneva considered driving past, pretending she hadn't seen him, but something made her stop. She got out of the car and walked over. "You're trespassing." "I know." Thad didn't look at her. "I just wanted to see it one more time." They stood in silence, watching contractors carry lumber into what had been the ballroom. "It looks different," Thad finally said. "It is different." Geneva's voice was neutral. "It's becoming something useful instead of just impressive." Thad absorbed that I signed the confession. Detailed everything we did, how we planned it, my role in it. "I know. Atticus sent me a copy. I also," Thad's voice cracked slightly. "I talked to my therapist about everything. Not just what happened with you. About how I was raised, what I was taught to value, why I made the choices I made." Geneva waited. "And I realized I don't know who I am." Thad turned to look at her finally. "I spent 30 years being who my parents wanted me to be. The dutiful son, the Blackwell heir, the guy who kept everyone happy. And none of it was real." Geneva felt unexpected sympathy. "That's not an excuse." "I know." Thad's voice was firm. "It's an explanation, not an excuse. What I did, what I didn't do, that's on me. The person I was raised to be is still me. I made those choices." They watched a truck deliver what looked like playground equipment. "What are you doing now?" Geneva asked. "Working as a junior project manager at a construction firm." Thad's smile was self-deprecating. "Turns out a degree from Yale doesn't mean much when your last name is Mudd. I'm basically starting over from the bottom." "How does it feel, honest?" Thad said after a moment. "For the first time in my life, I'm earning what I have. Not inheriting it, not borrowing against it. Actually earning it." Geneva considered him. "Are you happy?" "No." Thad's honesty was surprising. "But I'm building towards something real instead of maintaining something false. So maybe there's a kind of peace in that." A contractor called out to Geneva, had a question about door frames. She excused herself. Dealt with the issue, came back to find Thad still standing there. "I need to go," she said. "I know." Thad stepped back. I wanted you to know that I understand what I lost. Not the house or the money or the status, but you, the person you actually are. And I'm sorry I never bothered to find out while I had the chance." Geneva studied him, trying to decide if she believed it. Decided it didn't matter. Thad's journey was his own, now separate from hers. "I hope you find yourself." she said finally. "The real version, not the one your parents created." "I hope you find peace," Thad replied. "The kind that comes from building instead of destroying. I'm working on it." Geneva got back in her car. She watched him walk back toward the road in her rearview mirror, getting smaller with distance until he disappeared around a curve. 3 months after taking possession, Whitmore House opened its doors. 12 women and their children moved in on a warm May afternoon, carrying suitcases and shopping bags and the careful hope of people who'd learned not to trust good things. Geneva was there to greet them not as the owner but as someone who understood. She told them her story, the abbreviated version, about being thrown out in the cold, about finding her way back to warmth, about how buildings could be transformed, and so could lives. The first resident to arrive was a woman named Maria, 34, with 2 children under 6. She'd left her husband after he'd put her in the hospital for the 3rd time. She stood in the foyer looking up at the chandelier and started crying. Geneva touched her arm gently. "You're safe here." Maria wiped her eyes. "It's so beautiful. I've never lived anywhere this beautiful." "You deserve beautiful," Geneva said simply. "All of you do." Over the next weeks, Geneva visited regularly but didn't hover. She wanted the residents to feel ownership of the space, to make it theirs. She sat in on some of the therapy sessions with permission and listened to stories that echoed her own in different keys. Women who'd been told they were worthless until they believed it. Women who'd been isolated from support systems until they had nowhere to turn. Women who'd finally found the courage to leave and needed just enough help to rebuild. Geneva-funded job training programs helped women get certified in nursing, coding, bookkeeping. She connected them with lawyers who could help navigate custody issues. She made sure the children had access to counseling and summer programs and everything they'd need to heal from what they'd witnessed. The transformation wasn't instant or perfect. Some residents struggled. Some left and returned to dangerous situations. Some had setbacks and needed additional support. But many thrived. Found jobs, found apartments, found the strength to build lives defined by choice instead of fear. Geneva kept a photo wall in the administrative office, pictures of residents who'd graduated from the program, moved on to independence. Women with apartment keys and job badges and school acceptance letters. Children smiling in ways they hadn't when they'd arrived. This wall was her answer to the Blackwells. Every face a refutation of their cruelty. Every success a monument to what could be built from ruins. 6 months after the opening, Geneva sat in the office that had been the master bedroom, reviewing applications from women seeking admission. The demand far exceeded capacity. She was already looking at purchasing another property, expanding the program. Mrs. Havisham knocked on the doorframe. "There's someone here to see you. She's not on the calendar but says it's important." Geneva looked up, expecting perhaps a former resident or a donor. "Who is it?" Mrs. Havisham's expression was carefully neutral. "Constance Blackwell." Geneva felt her chest tighten. She hadn't seen or heard from any of the Blackwells since the encounter with Thad months ago. Hadn't wanted to. The chapter was closed, but apparently not completely. "Send her in," Geneva decided. Constance entered the office hesitantly, looking around with an expression Geneva couldn't quite read. The older woman had changed significantly. Her hair was different, less styled. The clothes were off the rack instead of designer. She'd lost the armor of wealth and looked smaller for it. They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Constance spoke. "I don't expect forgiveness." Geneva waited. "I came because Constance's hands twisted in her lap. I'm working at a women's boutique now, and one of our regular customers mentioned she'd spent 6 months here, at Whitmore House. She told me what you'd done, how you'd helped her." Geneva still didn't speak. "I didn't believe it at first." Constance continued. "Thought she must be confused. But I looked it up and it's true. You turned our house into a shelter. Your house was built on my land." Geneva's voice was even. "I turned my property into something useful." Constance flinched. "I deserved that. You deserve worse than that." Geneva leaned forward. "You tried to destroy me. You endangered my life. You framed me for a crime I didn't commit. And you did it with premeditation and satisfaction. I know. Constance's voice was barely audible. "I know what I did. Then why are you here?" Because Constance looked up and Geneva saw something broken in her eyes. "Because I need you to understand that I'm sorry. Not because it changes anything, not because I expect anything from you, but because you deserve to hear it." Geneva studied the woman who'd made her life hell for 11 months. "Why now?" "Because I've spent the last 6 months working alongside women who are struggling. Single mothers, recent divorcees, women escaping bad situations. And I hear their stories and I recognize myself." Geneva raised an eyebrow. "Not the specifics," Constance clarified, "but the pattern, the cruelty that comes from insecurity, the need to put others down to feel elevated, the fear that if you're not better than someone, you're nothing. That's insight." Geneva acknowledged. "It's not redemption." "I know." Constance's voice was steady. "Redemption isn't something you give me. It's something I have to earn through years of being better than I was. So what do you want?" "Nothing." Constance stood. "I just wanted you to know that what you built here matters, that the women you're helping deserve it, and that I'm genuinely sorry for trying to destroy someone who would eventually do this much good." She walked to the door, then turned back. "For what it's worth, you were right. About everything. We were cruel. We were arrogant. We destroyed ourselves. And you gave us a mercy we didn't deserve by not pursuing criminal charges." Geneva stood as well. "I didn't do it for you. I did it so I could be free of you. Prison would have kept us connected for years. This way I never have to think about you again. I understand." Constance opened the door. "I hope you find happiness, Geneva. Real happiness, not just satisfaction in our destruction." After she left, Geneva sat back down and looked out the window at the grounds. Women were in the garden, some tending vegetables, others just sitting in the sun. Children played on the equipment that had been installed where the formal rose garden once stood. She'd won, completely and thoroughly. Taken everything the Blackwells valued and transformed it into something that actively worked against everything they'd represented. But Constance was right about one thing. Satisfaction in their destruction wasn't the same as happiness. Geneva pulled out her phone and called Atticus. "I want to start a foundation, dedicated to helping women rebuild after domestic situations. Fund it properly, make it sustainable beyond Whitmore House." Atticus didn't sound surprised. "Budget. Whatever it takes." Geneva looked at the photo wall of successful graduates. "We'll start with $10 million annually, adjust as needed. That's a significant commitment. So is making sure that what happened to me doesn't destroy other women." Geneva's voice was firm. "I had resources. I had education. I had a safety net I didn't even know existed. Most people don't have those advantages. I'll start the paperwork." Atticus paused. "Your father would be proud, you know." Geneva felt emotion catch in her throat. "He taught me that land ownership carries responsibility. I'm just trying to live up to that." "You're exceeding it," Atticus said gently. "He taught you to protect yourself. You're choosing to protect others as well." After the call ended, Geneva sat in the quiet office and let herself feel it. Not triumph, not vindication. Just the simple satisfaction of knowing she'd taken something meant to break her and built from it something that might save others. The Blackwells had tried to make her small. Instead, they'd inadvertently shown her exactly how much power she had to make things better. That evening, Geneva stood on the porch where Constance had watched her freeze. The sun was setting over Connecticut, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. She could hear laughter from inside the house, children playing before dinner, women talking about jobs and school applications and futures that felt possible again. Geneva had learned something in the month since that frozen night. Revenge was empty calories. It filled you temporarily but left you hungry for something more substantial. What sustained you was purpose. Building instead of destroying. Creating instead of taking. Using power to lift others instead of crushing enemies. She'd won the war with the Blackwells. But the victory that mattered was this, transforming a monument to cruelty into a sanctuary for healing. Geneva walked back inside, closing the door on the sunset. Inside was warmth and light and the sound of people building lives from pieces. Inside was the future she'd chosen to create. The Blackwells were behind her now, a chapter closed and filed away. What lay ahead was entirely hers to write. And for the first time since standing on a frozen road wondering if she'd survive the night, Geneva felt something that wasn't anger or hurt or the cold satisfaction of revenge. She felt free.